Our study topic was Amish subgroups. The Amish are not one cohesive movement. While there are cultural and religious elements that define the Amish as a whole and distinguish them from the outside world, within that framework there are diverse affiliations, divisions, sects, and movements that make up the broader Amish community, and this diversity has greatly increased in just the last century. At the opening of the 20th century, there were approximately 42 geographically distinct Amish settlements in North America, which were representing 3 or 4 different affiliations. By 2012, the number of settlements had swelled to 493, and the number of affiliations had multiplied to more than 40. As the smaller subgroups within some affiliations are counted, the number of identifiable cohorts rises above 65, and that's not including more than 130 fairly independent congregations that lack a firm relationship to a wider affiliation. Although a multitude of Amish identities have cropped up over the 20th century, members of the 2000 church districts still broadly recognize one another as Amish. The Old Order. This is a general term for the conservative Amish mainstream and thus applies to a large number of different Amish groups. The Old Order Amish forbid the ownership of motor vehicles, the use of home electricity, and utilize some form of traditional Amish dress. They reject assurance of salvation, practice foot washing as a church ordinance, take communion twice a year, and practice strict non-resistance, forbidding all use of violent force. While affirming the need for the grace of Jesus Christ, Old Order Amish generally also believe that baptism and obedience to the rules and standards of one's church community are necessary for salvation. The map you see here shows the prevalence of the Old Order throughout the United States. You can see that the majority of the Old Order is spread over Ohio and Pennsylvania, with some large numbers in northern Missouri, southern Iowa, western Wisconsin, northern Indiana, and scattered throughout Michigan. The Old Order groups of both Amish and Mennonites are very similar to each other. The Old Order Mennonites are often referred to as the horse and buggy Mennonites or team Mennonites. As for the lifestyle of the Old Order, it's basically what you think of when it comes to the Amish. No electricity, no telephones allowed in the homes. Sometimes these are allowed at the edge of the property and tend to be used for business purposes. There are no motor vehicles for personal use, although they can use those for business purposes and other people's personal vehicles. There are no television or radio, and they are not allowed to listen to recorded music. They can only listen to a cappella. And farming is usually done without the use of modern tractors. They tend to use horses and mules instead, although there are some instances where they can use tractors without rubber tires. As for the attire of the Old Order, women are dressed in plain solid colors. They are generally dark, like your dark and navy blues. They wear full skirts that are no shorter than mid-calf, long sleeves, and some have the cape dress, while others will use a plain dress with an apron over the top. Men, again, dress in plain solid colors, the same dark navies and blues. Dark suits without lapels. They wear suspenders with black or straw-brimmed hats. For both men and women, they wear plain shoes, usually black, and they have a mandatory black stockings that they wear for public. Women and girls are not permitted to cut their hair, and their hair is generally always worn in a bun at the nape of their neck. Men who are married will grow out their beards, but they are not allowed to have a mustache. And head coverings are worn by all women and girls. Different colors or styles are indicative of what groups they're a part of. There are very subtle differences between these, and for us it'd be hard to pick out, but for the Amish it's very easy for them to tell. They do not wear jewelry, and they do not even wear a wedding band. So basically, the Amish that you're seeing when you're in Aldi's or Walmart or what have you, generally this is the attire that you would picture them to be in. In the church services of the Old Order, no instruments are allowed. They cannot be played or listened to. Shunning is practiced, and I know we've gone over this in the past, but just to recap, shunning is a discipline of sinners who are put out of fellowship. There are different degrees of shunning practice based on what the sinner has done or the community that they are living in, but basically it can range anywhere from complete avoidance of the offender to putting out of church meetings, but not completely avoided. Church services are held in a member's home. Seating is segregated for church services, and the ministry is not paid. They all have their regular jobs, and they just serve as volunteers that are selected by the lot. As far as education for the old order, children attend school in one-room schoolhouses and are taught by church members until the 8th grade, and higher education is not allowed, um, which is basically what we've been taught in this class so far about the Amish. This is typical for them. In the bottom right-hand corner there, you can see an image of typically the old order family. This is their dress, the darker colors, the dark blues. You can see the women have on the black stockings. The girls do not look like they're barefoot, but this is a fairly good example of how an old order family would look. The next affiliation that we are going to cover is the New Order. The New Order Amish are generally considered more liberal or progressive than most other Amish groups because of their greater allowance of technology. Some New Order Amish even allow their members to use electricity in their homes. The New Order Amish, however, still practice traditional plain dress and rely on horse and buggy for transportation. In respect to ethics, the New Order Amish are actually often stricter than the Old, particularly in the areas of sexual purity among their youth and restrictions on drinking and tobacco use. The split with the Old Order Amish happened in part because accusations that the New Order possessed a holier-than-thou attitude and their emphasis on purity. The New Order Amish instituted progressive religious programs like Sunday schools, Bible studies, and youth activities. These ethical and religious innovations are the primary cause of the division. The New Order is very similar to the Old Order with only a few varying exceptions, such as lifestyle. Like I said in the previous slide, they prohibit alcohol and tobacco use. A lot of Old Orders do allow this, and that is originally what caused the split. Again, some allow technology to be used for specific purposes, such as businesses on a more extreme level. And courting practices are cleaner, and more emphasis is placed on purity during the courtship. Attire is really the same. As you can see in the bottom right-hand corner, the little girl is dressed very similar to that of the Old Order children. Church services will include Sunday school. They are less strict with shunning practices, and churches will have an outreach or mission projects. And education is really the same again, where there is no higher education that stops at 8th grade. Next, we have the Conservative Mennonite. The Conservative Mennonites include numerous groups that identify with the more conservative or traditional element among Mennonite or Anabaptist groups, but who are not Old Order groups. The majority of conservative Mennonite churches historically have an Amish and not Mennonite background. Those identifying with this group typically drive automobiles, have telephones, use electricity, and some may even have personal computers. They also have Sunday school, hold revival meetings, and operate their own Christian schools. When it comes to the lifestyle of the conservative Mennonites, a lot of it is similar to the Old Order and New Order, but a little more progressive, such as electricity is permitted, along with telephones. There are some more restrictions on smartphones, though. Vehicles are permitted, although the restrictions on styles and colors. The antennas are required to be removed because they are not allowed to listen to the radio or watch TV. Some groups allow the use of filtered internet. Some groups do not allow this at all. It just kind of depends on which community they are involved in. Instruments are still not played or listened to. Some groups allow piano. And modern farming equipment is used. As far as the attire for the conservative Mennonite, it is still very similar to the Old and New Order. Such as women still dress in plain colors, but they do have simple patterns, and there are more colors that are allowed, as long as they just aren't drawing attention. Still full skirts, not shorter than the mid-calf, sleeves. They can be a little bit shorter just past the elbow. Men, again, dress is plain, solid colors or plaids, nothing too bold. Again, they all wear plain shoes, generally black with their black stockings. Again, women and girls are not permitted to cut their hair and almost worn in a bun. And just like the old order, men can grow out beards but no mustaches once they are married. And women and girls still wear head coverings. Different styles, again, indicate what group you're a part of, and no jewelry or even a wedding band. Church services is where conservative Mennonites tend to differ a little bit more. They are actually held in simple buildings. The seating is segregated with men and boys on one side and women and girls on the other. Their services are very predictable, about the same each week. People enter in silence and have fellowship after service. Just like Old Order, there are no instruments allowed in the church. Like I said before, some groups do allow piano for private use. So, in conservative Mennonites, shunning is replaced with something that they call excommunication, which generally means that someone has violated the standards or has sinned in the church, and they'll be put out of fellowship and won't receive the members' greetings, but they are still able to attend the service and be among the members. And they encourage to do what is necessary to rejoin the church. So it's a little less strict than shunning. They do have Sunday school, which is similar to the New Order, and revivals are held regularly and missions outreach are encouraged. Education for conservative Mennonites is still pretty similar to that of the New and Old Order. There is a little differentiation. Children attend school in simple church run schools, and they're taught by the church members until the 8th grade. There are some groups that are providing education until the 10th grade, and a few even up until the 12th grade, but that is not common. Something else uncommon among the conservative Mennonites, where there are a few groups allowing it, is that the children or people are permitted to continue their education to become doctors or nurses, but again, that's not common. And on the right side of the slide, you can see an accurate representation of the dress of the conservative Mennonites, and you can see here it's where it really starts to differ from your Old and New Order. There's a lot more colors, it's brighter, the headdress is a little bit differently, but again, they're a little less strict with their clothing. This next affiliation is called the Beachy Amish Mennonite. They are perhaps the most distinct faction within the Amish continuum. The Beachy Amish Mennonite allow motor vehicles, electricity in the homes, and even use English in their services. They still practice plain dress and forbid television and radio, though some allow limited use of the internet. They define themselves as evangelical in orientation and participate in global missionary work. They are a loosely affiliated network and vary in both doctrine and practice from one congregation to the next, but they are the Amish group most likely to uphold the true biblical gospel of salvation by grace alone through faith. The Beachy Amish Mennonite have a very loose government structure, so a lot of the groups vary in practice. Some are closer to the conservative groups, and others are closer to the moderate groups. But the basics of the Beachy groups would tend to have the same guidelines as the conservatives, such as the Old Order, with just a few exceptions. So, a few of the exceptions in lifestyle would be that they allow more instruments, although there are still some groups that do not allow any, and they do have less restriction on technology, allowing some smartphones and some movies. As far as attire, again, it's mostly the same as the Old Order, except they tend to stick to solid fabrics for clothing, but they do allow more embellishments, especially for the children, and there is less restriction on men's clothing. In Beachy Amish Mennonite church services, most groups do not have segregated seating, which is a lot different from the previous affiliations we have discussed. And for them, it is easier to come back into fellowship after being excommunicated. And as far as education, there wasn't a whole lot to be found on it. It's a lot similar to that of the Old Order and the New Order, except that they tend to receive higher education. Just depends, once again, on the group of Beachy Amish. And to the right, you can see a picture of a couple little girls. And this is a good picture to show the different embellishments that they have in their attire. Their sleeves are a little bit shorter above their elbow. You can see the one girl, her book bag has some hearts on it and some embellishments, and they have on regular tennis shoes, unlike just plain black shoes with black stockings, a little bit more varied, a little bit brighter. Next, we have the intermediate and moderate conservative Mennonites. These groups do not share the same level of strictness as the most conservative ones mentioned previously, but they do have similar origins or have withdrawn from the groupings that we've already talked about, such as making the use of the radio optional or even allowing more usage of the internet. Others have formed from their withdrawal from the other groups. These include smaller groups such as the Bethel Fellowship, Mid Atlantic Fellowship, and the Midwest Mennonite Fellowship. And there's numerous other unaffiliated congregations, but once again, all of these affiliations are basically just breaking off from one big name, which is Amish, and it's breaking into your individual beliefs, and these groups each find their own ways. The intermediate and moderate conservative Mennonites are pretty similar to that of the conservative groups, but they do have some differences, such as in lifestyle wise, there are fewer restrictions on vehicles, and some groups do not have any restrictions on vehicles. Television and radio is permitted. Internet and movies are usually allowed as long as they are considered clean, and most instruments are allowed to be used. As far as attire, they are less strict. Women still dress modest, but not necessarily a cape dress, and larger prints are allowed along with bolder colors. Men would still wear button down shirts for services, but there are a few restrictions on daily clothing, although most men would not wear shorts. Generally, for both, footwear is usually restricted. Not usually restricted, although some do wear black shoes for church only. Women and girls are permitted to trim their hair, but still keep it long so they can't cut it super short. And it is still usually kept in a bun, and they are even allowed to braid it. Men have less restrictions on facial hair, and it's generally just a matter of personal preference for them. Head coverings are worn still by most women, although they tend to be smaller and less distinct. And once again, no jewelry is used, not even a wedding band. As far as their church services, it's similar to what we previously discussed, but there are still some more differentiating factors, such as their buildings are still simple, but they do have their own church buildings, but they do have more comfort factors. Seating for services is not segregated. They allow for more spontaneous worship and tend to be more enthusiastic, a little less predictable. Sometimes instruments are allowed in the church. They still use excommunication, but it's a little less common and it's easier to rejoin the church. Sunday school is a part of the church services. Revivals are held regularly, and mission and outreaches are very much encouraged. The education for the intermediate and moderate conservative Mennonites is fairly similar to that of the Beachy Amish, such as some churches have their own schools, and it's more common for children to attend school for a longer period of time, and some people even choose to homeschool their children. It's a little bit, more of a personal preference for them. And some people are permitted to continue their education to become doctors or nurses, but again, this is not that common. There's just been a few instances where this has been allowed. The next affiliation we're going to talk about is the Theological Mennonites. There is a little less information out there on these groups, but they do tend to hold the most theological beliefs of the more conservative groups, but they do not have written standards, so to speak. So these groups really aren't easily distinguished from other Christian groups. They generally identify as Mennonite, but still hold to pacifism, strong work ethic, and adult baptism. They would also allow only male pastors and leaders. Some women still wear coverings for worship services, but few would wear them on a daily basis. Of the 7 ordinances practiced by most Mennonites groups, this is how these groups would practice them. So generally they would have marriage, communion or the Lord's Supper, foot washing, baptism, holy kiss for greeting fellow members, wearing of the women's veiling, and anointing with oil. Next, we have the Progressive Mennonites, and these are basically just Mennonite name and are quite liberal in theology and practice, and they even allow women pastors, and they are actually supportive of the LGBT agenda. The only thing distinguishing these groups from other Christian groups is that they still adhere to believers' baptism and believe strongly in keeping peace and nonviolence. And believers' baptism is basically just adult baptism. The Swartzentruber is the next Amish affiliation we're going to talk about. They are generally considered to be the ultra conservative Amish. They broke away from the Old Order groups primarily over the matter of strict and universal applications of shunning all who leave the Amish. So that's really the biggest differentiation between them and the Old Order Amish is that they really take shunning seriously, and if you leave, you're done. Next, we have the Reformist Amish. This is more of a movement and does not represent a separate Amish group. It's just more of a cluster of Amish congregations scattered throughout the various mainstream Old Order groups. The Reformists are defined by actively promoting moral reforms, many similar to those of the New Order Amish, while they are avoiding any religious challenges or technological reforms that would likely result in a break with their larger Old Order affiliations. So the Reformists somewhat resemble the moral reform movements in the medieval Catholicism that recognized the corruption, laxity, and hypocrisy in professing Christian culture and attempted to call people back to the holiness, but did so while being careful not to challenge any of the actual doctrines coming out of Rome. So the Reformist Amish simply want the Amish to live a more strictly moral lives while remaining committed to the teaching and practice of whatever Amish sect they are already in. So Reformist Amish are unlikely to even be recognized or recognize themselves as being part of the Reformist movement. As to that, that would sound, schismatic. So really, it's just a few people within, the Old Order, the New Order, Progressive Mennonites, or so on, that just have a different way of thinking and really support their background. The Indiana Swiss Amish of Adams County have different origins than the majority of North America's Amish. The ancestors of Amish in these and other Swiss communities arrived in America in the mid-1800s from Switzerland and the other surrounding areas. The Swiss Amish have maintained distinct customs and generally more conservative practices than the Pennsylvania German ethnicity Amish today found predominantly in Pennsylvania, Ohio, and other states. The Swiss Amish often travel only by open buggy, and Swiss Amish in the Adams and Allen County communities speak a different dialect from the Pennsylvanian German Amish settlements. They say that the difference between these two dialects are very distinct, but I think for someone like us, if we were to hear it, we would have no idea. But between the different Amish groups, they would definitely be able to tell. They do have other distinct cultural markers, such as they practice yodeling, as well as they have a very typical burial customs. So the Indiana Swiss Amish are still going to come from the same basis that, the Old Order came from. So really, these are just the differences between them and the basic Amish. So the language, again, they have their own dialect. That is a lot different from the majority of Amish. They practice yodeling, and they have their own burial customs, and they use mostly unmarked wooden markers to indicate the place of burial. Again, their buggies are open top, and you can see that to the right here, open top, and you can kind of see a little bit of their apparel. As far as technology, they tend to be more conservative in that use. And then their last names are a little bit more distinct and have a lot of Swiss background to them. And they rarely intermarry with Pennsylvania German Amish, and that's really the only group that's pretty distinct about not marrying into other groups. They really keep to themselves and that Swiss background. Before I wrap up this presentation, I'm going to answer some of the questions that were posted in the discussion board at the beginning of the semester regarding different subgroups of the Amish. So one of the questions was, can you tell the difference in appearance between each Amish subgroup? And generally, for the most part, all Amish seem relatively the same to the blind eye. So for us, we kind of think they all look the same. We're not going to tell much of a difference. Um, so the differences really come down to like dialect and a little bit in the clothing based on, are they going to wear bolder colors, the patterns, like the different cuts of the sleeves, the shoes, the types of buggies they drive. But to us, we're not really going to notice a difference, but from each Amish group, they're going to be able to tell. The next question is the Mennonite religion a subgroup of the Amish faith, or is a completely different thing? Because from the outside looking in, they seem very comparable. So the Mennonite is considered simply a subgroup of the Amish faith. They really come from the same basis. They've just kind of split off from their own beliefs. Next we have, I've seen people who appear to be Amish in Mongolian Grill and Walmart and Salina before. Do certain Amish groups do some modern things while others don't? So we had discussed earlier about the Swartzentruber. They are a lot more strict in their faith, so they may not be able to do such things, but it really comes down to just those types of groups and where they're at. So for our area, a lot of the Amish around here are able to go into those places and really experience the world. They are generally allowed to participate in aspects of modern society as long as they still are coherent to their religion. A few more questions. Having worked with the Amish on a daily basis over the course of the summer and fall, I discovered that different groups of Amish would all contribute to the same job and arrive at the same job site. Are these Amish generally from different subgroups, or would they tend to be from the same subgroup but located in different geographical areas? I thought that was a really neat question because that's not something I've ever caught on to, not being on Amish work sites. I always just assumed they came from the same area, so that was kind of neat for me to look up. So the basics of a subgroup is that they are all from the same building blocks. So for example, we all go to Lake Campus, but our subgroups could be our major. We all still participate in classes with one another, but we really have our own area of expertise, which I think is a good way to look at this question. They all have the same basis of the beliefs and are Amish. There can be several different kinds of subgroups on one worksite. It mostly would depend on the location. Some areas can have several different subgroups or one very large subgroup. For example, in Indiana, a lot of the Amish communities are mixtures of small subgroups, so they often mingle and migrate and work together, whereas in our area of Ohio, they are mostly from the same type of subgroup. So it really just depends on where you're located at. So next question, where are most of the subgroups located and why did they end up in that particular area? So the locations of subgroups really just depends on which group they broke off of. For example, in Holmes County, there are 4 main subgroups: the New Order, the Old Order, Swartzentruber, and the Andy Weaver. So the Andy Weaver is actually a mixture between the Old Order and the Swartzentruber and totals 15% of the Amish population in Holmes. So basically it comes down to which aspects of a group they decide to combine. So like I said, there are tons of subgroups that we just don't even necessarily recognize. It just really comes down to how they're going to mix what they believe and mingle within each other. When we go, there's 3 or 4 different Methodist churches in Salina, and they all do things a little bit differently. It's kind of the same concept if you want to look at it that way. The next question, what characterizes a subgroup as a subgroup? How do these subgroups feel towards each other? So characterizing a subgroup is really just splitting off of another group and combining ideals of another. They all come from the basis of the Amish religion. So like my previous example of us all being from Lake Campus, but our subgroups are our major, we all still get along even though we may differ in ideals and interests. Next, are Amish communities formed and defined by a single subgroup or affiliation, or do they allow for cohabitation resulting in blended community? So coming back to the example of the home county, Indiana, there were 4 groups, 3 originally, so the 3 original groups would be the Old Order, the New Order, and the Swartzentruber, and then they kind of blended together and a few broke off and created the Andy Weaver, which created the fourth group. Now, the blending and the mixing of the Amish is actually how these subgroups are created, and there can be often several in a community. It just depends on the location and how they decide to break off. Do several families in one group think, oh, we need to be more strict, we need to be a little bit less strict, and then they break off and kind of do their own thing while still being Amish? Okay, these are our last two questions. The first one is, are Amish allowed to leave and enter different subgroups? So, like I said before, mixing subgroups is exactly how they were created in the beginning. I can't say that it happens very often. I couldn't find a whole lot of it online, but it isn't necessarily frowned upon, um, but it doesn't necessarily always happen. Like I said, the one group of the Swiss Amish, they do not mingle and marry with the other Amish strictly because of their Swiss background. But when it comes to like the new and the old order, a lot of them, there's lots of commingling. But when the mingling does happen, that would generally take place during Rumspringa, which is when the younger Amish are able to go out in the world and date and experience life, which we've talked about this before in class. And that is when many Amish will meet other Amish and experience the other subgroups and really learn, and they decide, are they going to come back to that group, maybe go to a different one, get married, switch communities. I'm not saying that it happens often, but it's not necessarily frowned upon for most of them. So, which subgroups are the biggest and which are the smallest? It can be difficult to know which are the largest, but the most prevalent and widely practiced is definitely the New and the Old Order and the Mennonite. They're the most well known, widely practiced, tends to be the most spread out, and really hold down the true values of the Amish. And since there are so many different subgroups, there's no way to know which one is the smallest. Um, there's hundreds of affiliations that break off. There could be a new one that just broke off the other day and we'd have no idea. So it's really unknown which ones are the smallest. All right, and that was the end of my presentation on the subgroups of the Amish. This slide here is simply just the sources. I hope you were able to learn something and enjoy this presentation. I know that I definitely learned a lot by having to research the different subgroups, so I hope you enjoyed it. Thanks.